Continuing from our previous discussion on Hegel's historical poetics, let's now delve into the core of his doctrine of spirit. We won't get lost in every detail here, as that's covered elsewhere in his major works like the Phenomenology, Logic, and Philosophy of Right. The crucial starting point is Hegel's fundamental distinction, a stark opposition between spirit and matter. He uses world quite broadly, encompassing both the physical stuff and the mental or spiritual stuff. He concedes that physical nature plays a role in history, and if it directly impacts his subject, spirit, then an account of its mechanical workings is necessary. But his main focus, his true subject, is spirit. How do we characterize this spirit? Through what he calls its abstract characteristics, the means it employs to realize its idea, to actualize itself over time, and the shape that a perfectly embodied spirit would take. So what is this spirit? Hegel defines it as the opposite of matter. Matter, he says, is defined by something external. Its nature is determined from outside. Spirit, however, is self-contained existence, bei sich selbst sein. What does that mean? It means freedom. Freedom isn't just about doing whatever you want. It's about independence, autonomy, not being determined by anything outside yourself. And this self-contained existence is also self-consciousness, the awareness of your own being, of what you are potentially capable of becoming. Think about history. Hegel sees universal history as the exhibition of spirit in the process of working out the knowledge of that which it potentially is. History, then, is this unfolding drama where spirit figures out its own potential. Since self-consciousness is essentially freedom, the actualization of spirit in time must be the growth of the principle of freedom. This leads to his famous line, "The history of the world is none other than the progress of the consciousness of freedom." This wasn't just a catchy phrase. He believed this insight gave him the natural division of universal history, the way to understand its structure. Now, how does Hegel approach the historical field itself? He presents it as a puzzle, a set of phenomena from which critical intelligence needs to extract meaning. He gives us two crucial descriptions, two characterizations that are quite different and worth digging into. First, he looks at the historical field synchronically, as a snapshot in time. What does it look like? It's a chaotic mess of passions, self-interest, violence, dashed hopes, and frustrated plans. Think of it as a swirling storm of human activity. Second, he looks at it diachronically over time. Here, the field appears to be characterized by mere change. Things happen, things shift, but is there a deeper pattern? These two views serve different purposes. The first, the chaotic snapshot, is meant to be the raw material from which we generate concepts to see it not just as chaos, but as a spectacle of purpose. The second, the view of mere change, is the starting point for generating concepts to see it not just as random shifts, but as a process of development. Let's unpack these. Let's zoom in on that first characterization. History as a chaotic spectacle of passions. Hegel uses the metaphorical mode here. He doesn't just list events, he names them as phenomena. When you first glance at history, what hits you? Actions driven by needs, passions, characters, talents. It seems pretty obvious, right? These are the engines of history. Even if you see noble actions born of benevolence or patriotism, Hegel concedes they seem insignificant compared to the sheer scale of historical events. Reason might show up, but based purely on what we observe, there's no reason to deny that the most powerful drivers are passions, private aims, selfish desires. It's a raw, often brutal picture, a Schauspiel der Leidenschaften, a play of passions. It's easy to see the irrationality, the evil, the ruin of great civilizations, and feel a sense of moral disgust or even despair. This initial reaction, this aesthetic perception of misery and absurdity, naturally triggers a moral response. We see the irrationality, the corruption, the decay caused not by nature but by human will itself. A moral embitterment, a revolt of the good spirit arises. It's like looking at a truly horrifying painting. It makes you profoundly sad. The temptation is to throw up your hands, retreat into fatalism, or just withdraw into the comfort of our own private lives, away from the nasty business of the world stage. But, and this is key, even in this state of sadness and reflection, a question inevitably pops up in any conscious mind. To what principle, To what final aim have these enormous sacrifices been offered? This question is the pivot point. At this point, most people might try to make sense of it, all through reflective history. This usually means causal explanations why things happened, or typological reductions grouping events into neat categories. But Hegel resists this urge. He insists that this very panorama of sin and suffering, this chaotic spectacle, is the field that exhibits the means for realizing the essential destiny or the true result of world history. He's saying, don't try to smooth over the horror, acknowledge it. Moral reflection, while understandable, can't be the method for understanding history. Those attempts at causal or typological reduction, even if well-intentioned, either just sweep the difficult facts under the rug, or worse, confirm our suspicion that history is ultimately absurd. Hegel fully accepts that history looks like a panorama of sin and suffering. But he immediately frames this perception within that earlier question. These sacrifices, this suffering, must be seen as means toward some greater end. So, sin and suffering aren't the end of the story, they are the means. But what is the superior principle they lead to? This isn't something you can see directly with your eyes. It's not given to sense perception. Instead, Hegel suggests it's knowable in principle, perhaps through a kind of transcendental deduction, figuring out the categories needed to understand it, similar to how Kant approached science. He characterizes this ultimate end as principal plan of existence law. But he's careful. This is a hidden, undeveloped essence. It's true in itself, but not yet completely real, Wirkliche. Because it's still unfolding in history, it remains ultimately unknowable to science. So, where do we start? Not with the grand theory, but with the data before us, the panorama of sin and suffering and the conviction that it serves a greater purpose. Hegel then makes a bold move. He affirms passion. He quotes, "Nothing great has been accomplished in the world without passion." The historian's job is to study this panorama of sin and suffering. But he also has a concept, the means-ends relationship, and an idea, the full realization of all historical entities through concrete actualization. By using this concept, he brackets the raw data, avoiding both the metonymical trap of reducing everything to cause-effect chains and the ironic trap of just highlighting the absurdity. Passion, usually seen negatively, is elevated. It's recognized as necessary, even desirable, for achieving ends far beyond what any individual or group could imagine alone. This bridges the gap between the Enlightenment's failed attempt to separate reason and passion, and the Romantics' or idealists' false monisms. How? Through the state. Not just the bureaucratic machine, but the state in its ideal essence as objectified morality. The concrete union of idea and passion is liberty, under the conditions of morality in a state. What's the ideal state? One where private interests perfectly align with the common good, where each finds fulfillment in the other. But actual states, because they are concrete mechanisms, never quite reach this ideal. They fail to reconcile individual desires with the collective good. Now, here's the twist. This failure, this imbalance, is actually the space where specifically human freedom operates. Human freedom, a moral freedom, arises precisely because there's always a gap between what we desire and what the community demands. Things as they are versus things as they ought to be. But this freedom is also limited. Any attempt to fix the state, through reform or revolution, just creates a new mechanism with its own limitations. It's a perpetual cycle of striving and falling short. The aim, then, is to hold on to this awareness of the ironic nature of our situation, the paradox that freedom comes from limitation, from the tension between private and public spheres. This awareness allows us to believe in the possibility of exercising our freedom and the legitimacy of feeling dissatisfied with the status quo. Hegel criticizes the common complaint that ideals are crushed by reality. If you condemn the social condition simply because your ideals haven't materialized yet, you're being sentimental. It's easier to find flaws than to grasp the real value and import of things. Fault-finding is easy, but it misses the positive aspect, how these flawed situations provide the conditions for limited freedom. Hegel's perspective is that this real world, with its contradictions and suffering, is actually as it ought to be for achieving human ends with the means available. It echoes Seneca, This world is small, unless it contains everything that it seeks. The process itself provides the means. Does this mean individuals escape this tragic fate? Absolutely not. Those who pursue their aims with passion, will, and intelligence adequate to their immediate realization, those who seek to transform society according to their vision of the good life, become tragic figures. Think of the ordinary man content within societal limits. Think of the criminal evading rules for personal gain without changing the system. But heroes? Heroes are driven by a passionate belief in their own aims that clashes with the existing order. Caesar, for instance, reconstituted Roman society in pursuit of his ideal self-conception. Great men form purposes to satisfy themselves, not others. They don't learn from others. Others learn from them. These clashes between individual will and the established order are the axial events, the pivotal moments of world history. Because of this, the spectacle of history, viewed from within its unfolding, can be seen as a tragic drama. We don't need philosophical reflection to see this. Historical consciousness itself, combining aesthetic and moral sensibility, allows us to transform the absurdist epic of meaningless struggle into a tragic drama with ethical weight. Look at the fate of these world historical personalities. No happy endings. Labor, trouble, master passion. Success often leads to downfall. Alexander, murder Caesar, exile Napoleon. They lived like Shakespearean tragic heroes. The danger is that a purely moral reflection might lead us back to seeing their lives as ultimately meaningless, just like the ordinary folks stuck in their roles. But this view only arises from the metonymical mode, reducing subjective striving to mere mechanical cause-effect, ignoring the unique quality of the heroic will. Why is this reduction problematic? Because if history were just nature in disguise, we couldn't explain the domestication of humans or the rise of civilization. Savage man doesn't create high art or philosophy. Religion and basic custom emerge. Yes, but the form of religion shapes the state and culture. Assuming the savage and civilized minds are fundamentally the same biases analysis towards finding similarities when we need to explain differences. This search for similarities, ignoring crucial distinctions, fuels myths of Arcadia, the happy state of nature that enchanted Enlightenment thinkers and romantics alike. It's a seductive but ultimately misleading perspective. So the real problem becomes clear. How do we explicate the principles governing mankind's development through history? This development, seen over time, looks like a progression from a lower condition to a higher one. Seen as a snapshot, it appears as a coherent system of exchange between savagery and civilization. We need a framework to understand this dynamic. This brings us to a higher level of comprehension, synecdochic consciousness. Here, causal explanation gives way to typological explanation. The image shifts from mere chaos to a succession of forms or types of cultural achievement. And this apprehension is still framed under the aspect of tragedy. Now, Hegel makes a famous remark often misinterpreted as showing his formalism. He compares the historian to Kepler. Kepler had to be familiar with ellipses, cubes, squares, and their relations a priori before he could discover the laws of planetary motion from empirical data. These laws are forms of thought. Similarly, the historian needs pre-existing conceptual tools, a circle of conceptions, to understand the principles at play. But this doesn't mean imposing preconceived ideas arbitrarily. There must be a principle guiding the articulation of necessary concepts to distinguish the essential from the non-essential. Otherwise, we risk two dangers. Treating history like physics, confusing determinism with freedom, and formalism just recognizing patterns or formal coherences without deeper understanding. History requires different concepts, beginning, middle, and end, but not like a simple physical process. Think of a completed moral action in art or religion. It starts, undergoes a dialectical transformation, and culminates in a consummation or resolution, not just termination. Physical nature has no real beginning, middle, or end. It's eternal, existing only in space. Organic nature shows development like a seed growing. But even successful growth ends predictably, cyclically, not developing into something new across generations. History is different. Significant transitions show again, like the end of a tragic play or dialogue. Something dies, but something new is born. Crucially, this new thing isn't just the same essence returning. It's something new containing the old form as material, transforming it from an end in itself into a means for a higher end. This is the key difference. This leads to Hegel's second major characterization. History in general is therefore the development of spirit in time, as nature is the development of the idea in space. That German word Auslegung is key. It means laying out, spreading out, display, unfolding. It's about clarification, bringing latent contents into the light. But just seeing this unfolding isn't enough. We need to recapitulate that journey of consciousness, from the initial aesthetic shock of chaos, through the moral sadness of meaninglessness, to an intellectual perception of a process, a succession of forms. Looking at world history, we see a vast picture of changes and deeds, of infinitely manifold forms of peoples, states, individuals in unresting succession. This view evokes a different emotional state than the chaotic spectacle. Everything that can enter into and interest the soul of man, all our sensibility to goodness, beauty, and greatness, is called into play. We still see suffering, but also beauty, freedom, energy, variety. We see patterns, sometimes slow progress followed by triviality, sometimes immense effort yielding little, sometimes small things leading to huge outcomes. Events constantly vie for our attention. The first thought is simply change in general. This quickly turns into sadness, like facing ruins. But then, recognizing the formal coherences, the next thought emerges. While change imports dissolution, it involves at the same time the rise of a new life. That while death is the issue of life, life is also the issue of death. A glimmer of continuity amidst the flux. How do we plot this succession of forms? Hegel looks to nature again, but finds existing models inadequate. Oriental ideas like metempsychosis or the phoenix myth suggest a cycle, death leading to life. He calls this insight grand but insufficient. It applies generally to nature, not specifically to individual histories, and it oversimplifies the sheer variety of historical forms. Spirit, he argues, is different. It consumes its envelope, destroys itself, but emerges exalted, glorified, purer. It makes war upon itself, works existence into a new form, and each phase becomes material for elevating itself to a new grade of Bildung. It's not just recycling, it's qualitative transformation. But why does this happen? The principles remain unexplained. We need an internal perspective, seeing it not just as a sequence of equal parts, but as an autonomous process of self-manipulation, exertions in different modes and directions. The prior form becomes the material and stimulus for the successor. Abstract change gives way to spirit manifesting, developing, perfecting its powers. We learn about these inherent powers by studying the products and formulations history generates. Therefore, the process must be viewed as activity. Der Geist handelt wesentlich, macht sich zu dem, was an sich ist, zu einer Tat, zu seinem Werk, so wird sich Gegenstand, so hat sich als ein Dasein vor sich. Spirit essentially acts, makes itself what it is in itself, an act, a work, thus it becomes object to itself, possesses itself as existing being before itself. Just as with individuals, the life of every people or nation is a tragedy, and the appropriate way to grasp it is as a tragic drama. Hegel applied this tragic mode to individual civilizations in his philosophy of history. He didn't fully justify it there, assuming it was the standard way historians approached such topics. Elsewhere, he argued for it as the highest form of reflective historiography. An unself-conscious historian might see the rise and fall pattern and conclude it's just fate, a tragedy en gros. But contemplation reveals a sequence of tragedies. Each defeat, each dissolution, is an epiphany of the law governing the whole sequence. But this law isn't like natural law. It's the law of history, which is the law of freedom figured in every human project ending tragically. And this law, governing the whole tragic unfolding, ultimately points towards a comic resolution. Comedy comes logically after tragedy, affirming life's needs against the insight of inevitable doom. A civilization's death isn't like an individual's. A people carries its own negation within its generality. A people's task is to be something rather than nothing, requiring means beyond mere instinct. The ideal is to achieve a unity of ideal and real, understanding its own laws and justice scientifically. But the tragic flaw lies in the asymmetry between this grand intention and the specific means used. This flaw becomes visible in late stages, leading to staleness, isolation, and irony, talking virtue, practicing vice. It's the breakdown of the connection between the ideal and the lived reality. However, this separation, this transformation of practice into vice, paradoxically purifies the ideal. It releases it from the constraints of its actualized existence, giving concrete minds the chance to grasp of the ideal in its essence. This prepares the ideal for release, for transmission across time and space to other peoples. Think of the Greeks. Their naive records show what they were, but Sophocles, Aristophanes, Thucydides, Plato show the ideal in its generality. These witnesses represent the late forms of Greek consciousness. Grasping this ideal preserves and dignifies the civilization. While the prophet fades, its spirit is saved through consciousness in thought and art as an ideal form. Spirit annuls its temporary reality but gains the essence, the thought, the universal element of what it only was. This grasping isn't just preservation, it's alteration. It's the raising of the principle to another, and in fact, higher principle. This elevation justifies seeing the whole panorama of sin and suffering as ultimately comic, providential. Understanding the thought involved in this transition is vital. It's the contradiction of human growth. The individual remains unified through development, yet rises to higher self-consciousness. So too a people develops, remaining what it was, yet reaching the grade of universality. Here lies the fundamental necessity of change, the soul of philosophical comprehension of history. This comprehension rests on seeing history as development toward universality, where spirit elevates itself to a self-comprehending totality. The necessity of every civilization's self-destruction is sublimated. We see its institutions and ways of life not as eternal realities, but as means, abstract organizational forms for realizing its ideal ends. Their passing should concern us less than the death of a friend or a hero. Hegel uses a powerful metaphor. The life of a people ripens to a fruit, its activity aiming for complete manifestation. But this fruit doesn't return to the people, it becomes a poison draught. The people cannot let go of this draught, driven by insatiable thirst. The taste of the draught is its annihilation, though at the same time the rise of a new principle. Destruction becomes the means of creation. Comparing this to Socrates illuminates the metaphor. Socrates' death was tragic, the death of a virtuous man, revealing the contradiction between him and Athens, teaching a new moral principle. His death confirmed morality as a practical rule, not just an ideal. It was both his death and the elevation of his principle into a model for others. It showed that living by principle and dying for it transforms it into an ideal. Recognizing this, that this death is also the means to transform human life and morality to a higher level of self-consciousness, is the insight of the comic vision, the highest comprehension Hegel offers. This comic vision transcends fear of fate. It's the return of everything universal into certainty of self. It's a complete loss of fear of the strange and external, a state of spiritual good health and self-abandonment. This state, Hegel claims, is uniquely found in that kind of Aristophanean comedy. It's a position of confident understanding. Can we know the future? No, history deals only with past and present. But based on our understanding of history as a progressive development leading to our present, the twofold nature of history as both a cycle and a progression becomes clear. The life of the ever-present spirit is a circle of progressive embodiments. From one angle they exist side by side, from another they appear as past. This means the grades which spirit seems to have left behind are not lost, but are still alive and retrievable in the depths of the present. There's a continuity, a potential for revisiting past stages. These closing words echo the beginning of the phenomenology. The goal, absolute knowledge, is found through recollection of spiritual forms Geister. Their conservation, looked at contingently, is history, looked at intellectually, it's science. Together they form the recollection and Golgotha of absolute spirit, its reality, truth, certainty, without which it would be lifeless. And then, the final hymn to the negative, the chalice of this realm of spirits foams forth to God his own infinite. A transcendent note. So, What's the overall picture of Hegel's conception of historical knowledge? It's a sustained effort to hold on to the essential irony of the human condition, the paradox of freedom arising from limitation, without falling into Enlightenment skepticism or romantic solipsism. He achieves this by turning irony itself into a method. He brackets the causal, metonymical, and formalist metaphorical reductions within the broader synecdochic view, dissolving intellectual certitude, the pride of knowing the whole, while promoting moral self-certitude, the confidence to affirm one's right to strive for the ideal. This allows for conflict between individuals and the collective to be unresolved beforehand, judged only in the process. His journey takes us from the initial metaphorical shock of history, through metonymical and synecdochic interpretations, to an ironic grasp of ambiguity, settling finally on a general synecdochic identification of the whole as a comedy. The explanation mode is immediately metonymical and synecdochic, justifying causal laws of spirit and freedom. The employment mode for specific segments is tragic, resolving conflict into higher consciousness and epiphany of law. But the ideological implications remain ambiguous. In a causal system, no right or wrong. In a formal system, no better or worse. Only cause and effect, means and ends. Yet, the ironic consciousness perceives the whole interplay as a cause, whose end is the means, the progressive elevation of humanity through higher self-consciousness, clarifying the trend towards rational enlightenment and integration. All previous dramas, pathetic, epic, tragic, are sublated into a human comedy, a theody justifying man's ways to himself. Ultimately, the most we can extract is an aesthetic apprehension with strong moral and rational grounds, but the specifics of the whole remain elusive. In his philosophy of history proper, Hegel famously broke down the history of any given civilization into 4 phases: birth and growth, maturity, old age, and dissolution and death. Think of Rome, foundation to Second Punic War, then consolidation under Caesar, then the rise of Christianity, then the fall of Byzantium. These phases correspond to levels of civilizational self-consciousness, in itself, for itself, in and for itself, by, in and for itself. They also map onto classical drama, pathos, agon, sparagmos, and agnoresis. For Rome, this meant conflict, expansion, turning inward, and dissolution, paving the way for Germanic culture. These phases aren't just labels, they indicate existential relationships, ways of explaining, representing, and symbolizing meaning within the whole process. Crucially, what Rome was at any stage isn't reducible to what it did, or to a simple cause-effect chain, or a self-contained totality. Identifying the phase, explaining its nature, characterizing its attributes, and relating it to other phases, all these aspects have equal weight. Some see this as just projecting dialectical categories: thesis, antithesis, synthesis. Hegel might agree they're fundamental, but I prefer viewing them as conceptualizations of different modes of relationship, reflecting how language and consciousness operate. He characterized Rome as the prose of life, contrasting it with the poetry of the East and Greece. It was a formal way of life, held together by politics, law, and war, leaving little energy for high art or philosophy. And that brings us to the end of this exploration of Hegel's framework for understanding historical knowledge. It's a complex structure, aiming to navigate the inherent tensions and ambiguities of history through a sophisticated interplay of concepts and perspectives.